For centuries, people believed the story of England was already written. They believed they knew exactly where the English came from. Some said they were Celts. Others believed they were descendants of the Anglo-Saxons. Many pointed to the Vikings, while others argued that the Norman Conquest changed everything forever. History books offered simple answers. But history is rarely simple. Today, thanks to one of the greatest scientific revolutions of the 21st century, researchers are uncovering a completely different story. Hidden inside ancient skeletons buried beneath English fields, inside caves untouched for thousands of years, and beneath forgotten cemeteries discovered during construction projects, scientists have found something extraordinary: ancient DNA. Tiny fragments of genetic material preserved for thousands of years are revealing secrets that no king, no chronicler, and no ancient manuscript could ever tell. And what they discovered shocked historians around the world. The people we call English today are not descendants of just one ancient nation. Instead, they carry the genetic fingerprints of countless migrations stretching back more than 10,000 years. Every invasion, every migration, every new culture left its mark. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentary-style stories backed by archaeology, ancient DNA, and real historical discoveries, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Every week we uncover forgotten civilizations, hidden mysteries, and the true origins of humanity. Now, let's travel back to a world almost impossible to imagine. More than 10,000 years ago, England didn't exist. Not as we know it today. There were no castles, no villages, no roads, no cities. Even the English Channel had not yet become the sea that separates Britain from mainland Europe. Instead, a vast plain connected Britain to what is now France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Scientists call this lost land Doggerland. It was a rich landscape filled with forests, rivers, lakes, and enormous herds of wild animals. Red deer wandered through thick woodlands. Wild horses raced across open grasslands. Massive aurochs, the gigantic ancestors of modern cattle, roamed freely. For small groups of hunter-gatherers, Doggerland was paradise. They followed migrating animals. They fished in rivers. They gathered berries, nuts, and edible plants. Their entire world moved with the seasons. These people had no idea that thousands of years later, their DNA would become one of the most important scientific discoveries in European history. Archaeologists have recovered stone tools, animal bones, and human remains from this ancient world. When scientists extracted DNA from some of these skeletons, they discovered that Britain's earliest known inhabitants belonged to a population that had spread across Western Europe after the last ice age. These hunter-gatherers had survived one of the harshest climates humans had ever faced. Gelidation after generation. They adapted to changing environments. They built simple shelters. They mastered fire. They crafted sophisticated stone tools. Their lives were incredibly difficult, yet they survived against extraordinary odds. One of the most famous discoveries came from a skeleton found inside Gough's cave in Somerset, known today as Cheddar Man. He lived around 10,000 years ago. For decades, historians could only guess what he looked like, but modern DNA technology changed everything. Scientists reconstructed many aspects of his appearance. The results surprised the world. Rather than matching traditional artistic depictions, genetic evidence suggested that Britain's early hunter-gatherers likely had dark skin combined with blue or green eyes. This discovery reminded everyone of an important truth: human appearance has changed dramatically throughout history. The people living in Britain 10,000 years ago looked very different from those living there today, yet they represent one of the earliest chapters in the genetic story of England. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherers lived successfully across Britain. Then everything changed, not because of war, not because of disease, but because of one of the greatest inventions in human history: agriculture. Around 6,000 years ago, new people began arriving from continental Europe. Unlike the hunter-gatherers, these newcomers didn't spend their lives following wild animals. Instead, they brought something revolutionary. They carried seeds, they raised domesticated animals, they cleared forests, they built permanent settlements, they transformed the landscape forever. These early farmers originally descended from populations that had expanded from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, through southeastern Europe over many centuries. As they slowly spread westward, they carried not only farming techniques but also entirely new lifestyles. Villages appeared, wooden houses became common, large communal monuments were constructed. Ancient burial chambers began to dominate the countryside. Across England today, many of these Neolithic monuments still survive: stone circles, long barrows, massive earthworks. They remain silent witnesses to one of Britain's greatest cultural transformations. Ancient DNA revealed something equally astonishing. These early farmers were genetically very different from the hunter-gatherers already living in Britain. For years, archaeologists debated whether farming spread simply because local people learned new techniques. DNA answered the question. Large numbers of farming communities actually migrated into Britain. Over time, their ancestry became dominant across much of the population. In other words, one of the biggest changes in English genetic history happened thousands of years before the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, or the Vikings ever arrived. History was already being rewritten. Yet another dramatic chapter was still ahead. Around 4,500 years ago, mysterious newcomers appeared once again. Today, archaeologists refer to them as the Beaker people, named after the distinctive bell-shaped pottery they carried across Europe. For many years, nobody understood exactly who these people were. Then ancient DNA solved another mystery. The Beaker migrations represented one of the largest population changes ever identified in prehistoric Britain. Within only a few centuries, the genetic landscape changed dramatically. These newcomers introduced new technologies. They worked with copper and bronze. They developed new burial traditions. They reshaped society. Their arrival marked the beginning of Britain's Bronze Age. Scientists estimate that much of the earlier farming population was gradually replaced or absorbed into these expanding communities. It remains one of the most significant demographic transformations ever detected through ancient DNA. But who exactly were these newcomers? Where did they come from? And why did their arrival permanently change the ancestry of millions of future English people? Those answers take us into one of the most fascinating periods of European prehistory. The arrival of the Beaker people marked one of the greatest turning points in Britain's ancient history. They did not simply bring a new style of pottery. They brought new technologies, new traditions, and a different genetic heritage that would shape the population of Britain for thousands of years. Archaeologists discovered beautifully crafted drinking vessels, copper daggers, finely made stone wrist guards used by archers, and carefully constructed burial sites unlike anything that had existed before. At first, researchers believed these objects spread only through trade. But ancient DNA told a much bigger story. When scientists compared skeletons buried before and after the Beaker migration, they discovered a dramatic genetic shift. Over the following centuries, ancestry associated with these newcomers became widespread across much of Britain. This was one of the clearest examples of a major prehistoric population change identified through ancient DNA. The Beaker communities were skilled metalworkers. For the first time, bronze tools began replacing stone. Axes became stronger. Weapons became deadlier. Farmers could clear forests more efficiently. Communities expanded faster than ever before. Trade networks stretched across Europe. Ideas moved alongside people. Britain was no longer isolated. It had become part of a growing European world. As generations passed, families mixed together, languages changed, customs evolved. Children inherited traditions from many different ancestors. This pattern, migration followed by mixing, would repeat throughout English history. By around 800 BC, Britain entered another remarkable period. Today we call it the Iron Age. Iron transformed everyday life. Unlike bronze, iron ore existed in many parts of Britain. Tools became more common. Weapons became stronger. Agriculture became more productive. Small farming villages gradually developed into larger tribal territories. Hill forts appeared across southern England. Many still stand today on high ridges overlooking the countryside. From above, they resemble enormous rings carved into the landscape. These forts were not simply military bases. They were centers of trade, politics, and community life. Each represented the power of local tribes. It was during this period that the people later described by Greek and Roman writers began to appear in historical records. Today, many of them are collectively called the Celts. But this word often creates confusion. Modern research suggests there was no single united Celtic nation occupying Britain. Instead, there were many different tribes, sharing related languages and certain cultural traditions: the Iceni, the Catuvalauni, the Trinovantes, the Brigantes, and many others. Each had its own leaders, territories, and alliances. Some traded peacefully. Others fought fierce wars against neighboring tribes, yet together they created the complex society that existed just before the Romans arrived. For generations, historians believed modern English people inherited most of their ancestry directly from these Iron Age communities. Ancient DNA paints a more detailed picture. Iron Age populations already carried ancestry from earlier hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and Bronze Age Beaker communities. In other words, long before recorded history, Britain's people were already the descendants of multiple ancient populations. The idea of a completely pure ancient people simply doesn't fit the evidence. History had always been about movement, about change, about people meeting other people. Then, in 55 BC, one of history's greatest military commanders looked across the English Channel. His name was Julius Caesar. Curious about the island beyond the sea, and eager to strengthen his political reputation, he launched expeditions into Britain. Although these early campaigns were limited, they introduced Britain to the growing power of Rome. Almost a century later, in AD 43, Emperor Claudius ordered a full-scale invasion. Thousands of Roman soldiers crossed the Channel. Legions advanced into southeastern Britain. Powerful tribes resisted, some surrendered, others fought fiercely. One of the most famous leaders was Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. After suffering brutal treatment under Roman rule, she led a massive uprising. Entire Roman settlements were destroyed. For a brief moment, it seemed Rome might lose Britain, but the rebellion was crushed. Boudica disappeared from history. Rome remained. Over the next several centuries, Britain changed beyond recognition. Straight roads stretched across the countryside. Stone bridges crossed rivers. Bathhouses, temples, villas, and bustling towns appeared. London, known then as Londinium, grew into an important commercial center. Merchants arrived from every corner of the Roman Empire. Soldiers came from Gaul, engineers from Italy, traders from Spain, officials from North Africa, auxiliary troops from the Middle East and beyond. The Roman Empire connected 3 continents. Britain became one small part of that enormous world. For many years, people imagined Roman Britain as a place populated only by Italians ruling local Britons. Archaeology and scientific research show a far richer picture. People of many backgrounds lived side by side. Some married local families. Children grew up with mixed ancestry. Cultures blended. Languages mixed. Religions evolved. The Roman period added another important layer to the long genetic and cultural story of England. Yet, the Roman occupation would not last forever. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was weakening. Economic problems spread. Political instability increased. Barbarian invasions threatened Roman territories across Europe. Gradually, soldiers stationed in Britain were recalled to defend the empire elsewhere. Roman authority faded, roads remained, cities survived, but centralized Roman government disappeared. Britain entered one of the most mysterious periods in its history. Historians once called it the Dark Ages, not because life stopped, but because written records became much scarcer. This uncertainty created one of history's greatest debates. What happened after Rome left? Did local Britons continue ruling themselves? Did new invaders completely replace them? Or was the truth somewhere in between? For centuries, nobody knew. Then ancient DNA entered the story once again. As Roman rule disappeared from Britain, the island entered one of the most mysterious periods in European history. Cities slowly declined. Many grand Roman buildings were abandoned. Trade became less organized. Without the protection of the Roman army, local kingdoms were left to defend themselves against new threats. Across the North Sea, another movement had already begun. Small groups of warriors, farmers, and families from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands started crossing the sea. History remembers them as the Anglo-Saxons. For centuries, historians believed they invaded Britain and completely replaced the native population. It was a dramatic story. The old inhabitants disappeared. The newcomers took over. England was born. But when scientists began extracting DNA from early medieval cemeteries, the picture became far more complex. Ancient skeletons from Anglo-Saxon burial grounds revealed that many migrants really did settle in eastern and southern Britain. Their ancestry became an important part of the population. However, the DNA also showed something equally important. The earlier Romano-British people did not simply vanish. Instead, many communities survived. Over generations, local Britons and Anglo-Saxon settlers mixed together. Marriage, trade, alliances, and everyday life slowly blended these populations into new communities. England was not created in a single invasion. It was created through centuries of interaction. Villages expanded into kingdoms: Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Wessex. Each kingdom competed for land and influence. Old tribal identities slowly faded. A new identity gradually emerged: the English. Even their language reflected this transformation. Old English developed mainly from the Germanic languages spoken by Anglo-Saxon settlers, but over time it absorbed influences from Latin, surviving Celtic languages, and later Norse and French. Language was evolving just as the population was. Yet another wave of newcomers was already approaching Britain's shores. At the end of the 8th century, terrifying ships appeared on the horizon. Long, narrow vessels with carved dragon heads sliced through the sea. The Vikings had arrived. The first recorded Viking raid in England targeted the monastery of Lindisfarne in AD 793. For Christian Europe, it was a shocking event. Monasteries were wealthy and lightly defended. The Vikings struck quickly, taking valuables before disappearing back across the sea. At first, these raids were seasonal, but later they became permanent settlements. Large Viking armies established control over much of northern and eastern England. This region became known as the Danelaw. Contrary to popular myths, Vikings were not only raiders, they were also traders, explorers, craftsmen, and farmers. They founded towns, built marketplaces, established families, and once again, ancient DNA reveals what happened next. Rather than replacing the local population, Scandinavian settlers mixed with existing communities. Children inherited ancestry from both groups. Culture blended, traditions merged. Even today, many place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaite reflect this Viking heritage. Modern genetic studies suggest Scandinavian ancestry is still detectable in parts of northern and eastern England, although it represents only one layer within a much older genetic history. Then came another event that every English schoolchild learns about. The year was 1066. Across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed he had the rightful claim to England's throne. After defeating King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, William became William the Conqueror. The Norman Conquest transformed English politics forever. French-speaking nobles replaced much of the Anglo-Saxon elite. Massive stone castles rose across the countryside. A new aristocracy took control. The legal system changed, architecture changed, government changed. Even the English language absorbed thousands of French words. But what about DNA? Did the Normans dramatically change England's genetic makeup? Modern research suggests their genetic impact was likely much smaller than their cultural and political influence. The Norman ruling class was relatively small compared with England's overall population. They transformed institutions more than they transformed ancestry. This reminds us of an important lesson. Sometimes a small group of people can completely reshape a country's culture without replacing its population. As centuries passed, England continued welcoming merchants, refugees, craftsmen, scholars, sailors, and immigrants from many parts of Europe and beyond. Every generation added another thread to an already ancient tapestry. By the time the modern era arrived, the English people already carried thousands of years of shared history within their DNA. And then, science finally learned how to read it. When researchers compared thousands of ancient genomes with those of people living in Britain today, they discovered that modern English ancestry is the product of every major chapter in Britain's past. The earliest hunter-gatherers, the first fur farmers, the Beaker migrations, Iron Age communities, Roman-era populations, Anglo-Saxon settlers, Viking families' Norman influence, each contributed in different ways to the people who live in England today. No single migration tells the whole story. No single tribe can claim to be the sole ancestor of the English. The truth is far more fascinating. England was never built by one people. It was built by generations of people who arrived, settled, adapted, and became part of a shared history. Every ancient skeleton uncovered from the soil adds another piece to that remarkable puzzle. Every new DNA sequence reminds us that history is not fixed. It continues to evolve with every scientific discovery. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: our ancestors traveled farther than we once imagined. They crossed mountains, rivers, forests, and seas. They survived climate change, wars, epidemics, and hardship. They met strangers. They built families. And over thousands of years, those countless lives became the story of England itself.